let's get started. So it's great to see everyone's work kind of getting your block outs into Unreal. I know that can always be a really fun time, kind of just really diving in, playing around with the tools, trying to translate your kind of initial pitches, your initial ideas into kind of these 3D worlds. It's also really good to see people starting to kind of scale back the sizes of their environments. I know kind of it was something I stressed in the first week in everyone's homework, as well as the live Q&A. But again, we want to make something that is, something that you can actually realistically complete in the 10 weeks. And we can already see that, here we are in week 2 and we're starting week 3. Things are going to start to really ramp up. And we want to make sure that we have quality assets, a quality looking environment, than something that's just a giant open world or a kind of massive level. When we look at things that we see in portfolios from actual game environments and everything, you do have to remember those are generally made over the course of months and months, sometimes years, in any one kind of screenshot. And they're also worked on by numerous other people in a studio, whether it's being outsourcing all the assets they're getting from an outsourcing team, or just other people working on those levels. So we do want to compare our artwork and our levels to what we see in the industry for quality standards, but we don't necessarily want to compare it in terms of quantity, just because we are trying to make something that is feasible in 2.5 months. It's not an exorbitant amount of time, especially when a lot of you are learning just brand new tools. So good to see everyone kind of getting the hang of that. And always remember, the thing you can do is you can kind of really block out a lot of extra environment in your scene, and then kind of, go back in once the class is finished and start to really populate those areas. I've had a few students who've done that, and, the results have always been really great because they were able to just kind of keep expanding and making a gigantic environment that they really hoped to when they first started out. All right, let's get into some questions here. So really only one for the kind of earlier questions that was left here. Again, remember, if you do have a question throughout this whole live Q&A, don't hesitate to ask. I'll try to remember to read it out loud so that the people who don't have the chat on their screen can actually see what is the actual question. So Lewis was asking about the terrain system and the landscapes lotting dynamically, kind of removes a lot of sculpted details and areas where there's large changes in height. And the only way around this is to kind of just have kind of either a higher density. And he was wondering what games like Uncharted, Horizon, Red Dead do to kind of handle their terrain system, seeing a little less limitations. So one thing Unreal has kind of already built into their landscape tools is basically automatic handling of lotting the terrain. So the terrain landscapes are really expensive in terms of having something, really massively loaded at all times. They're kind of a big technical challenge, and Unreal really needs to have a way to kind of really handle that. And generally, they are going to, or in the back end, Unreal has already pretty much set up whatever the default lotting system is for pretty much anyone who's using the engine. Because remember, they are optimizing this engine to run at a great performance for pretty much anyone from an indie studio all the way to a AAA team. And not everyone's going to have a technical artist on their studio's kind of payroll to be able to really kind of go in there and develop a lotting system. So it kind of has a cascading lotting effect where it kind of lots out in 4 sections where, right around the player at a given distance, it's going to be, the highest res terrain. And then as it gets further and further, it's going to start to lot out. Obviously, this is for performance reasons. I do know you can change it. I don't know how to change it. It's a little outside of my technical aspects, as it is the landscape is a pretty complex system. Now, I know there was a kind of mention about I think world composition here, maybe. Yeah. So what is world composition? How is that different to kind of just the landscape tiles that we're using right here? So world composition is for when you're developing essentially massive open world games where, you know, your landscape is a lot bigger than what we're seeing here, just this kind of big chunk. It's kind of like, it's for landscapes that will probably be maybe 7 or 8 times as big. And what the world composition does is it breaks that single gigantic, absolutely massive landscape into smaller little landscape chunks like this. And what it allows a designer to do is kind of individually load each of these sections at a time, because you're never going to be able to have essentially all of a level, you know, if this was fully done, fully detailed out where a player could roam around, you're never going to be able to have that loaded all at one time. Now, I know this is kind of a bit of a technical thing, but you're never going to be able to have it all kind of loaded and in at one time. So you have to kind of dynamically load it. And that's what world composition is doing. It's, if you can imagine, you know, kind of having maybe 7, 8 other of these kind of world chunks, you know, it could spread on infinitely here in Unreal. And it's breaking these chunks up so that in memory, it's only having to load whatever this chunk is, and then all the assets, all the textures that are pertain to this chunk. So it's really efficient in that regard, but it's nothing that any of you probably will have to really deal with in terms of the scenes that you're building, because again, it is just for a performance reason. And it kind of really depends on whatever game project you're using. Now, for a game like, well, actually, we'll just go over the reasons why Unreal kind of has a, not the highest resolution kind of terrain system. So the Unreal's terrain system is completely based off a height map. Almost every terrain engine's terrain is based off a height map. And so basically it's like taking a normal height map and using that to displace the terrain. So what Unreal is doing in the background is it has essentially a dynamic height map being painted. So anytime you kind of come in here and you're like, oh, cool, you know, I want to sculpt up my terrain, whatever, you know, kind of sculpt all this stuff. Right now it's editing that height map. It's telling, you know, it's either saying, okay, it's white for where it's obviously being pushed out, and then, you know, it's black for when you're pushing it. It's a pretty big height map. And the only issue with that is, and this is what every essentially kind of like paintable landscape system has, is that you can't really do kind of really, you can't do cut-ins very well. It can really, it's essentially just pushing and pulling those vertices up. There are obviously the smoothing tools that you can kind of, and retopologize it and try and adjust some of those things. It's never going to do a great job, because always try and think of it as it's basically either, it's using basically a flat 2D height map to generate your entire terrain in there. And so with that knowledge, we want to kind of think about how we want to actually build out our landscape and how we want to use our landscape to our advantage with this kind of limitation in there. So we don't really want to be painting or trying to create giant cliffs with the landscape tool. The landscape tool is really there for its really efficient lotting of terrain and collision that a player is going to walk on, and just the amount of shaders that you can kind of apply to that ground. So, you know, obviously we can see here with kind of, you know, painting our landscape layers, you can paint a whole bunch of different landscape layers, which you can't really do on any individual mesh. It's going to be a lot more difficult. The landscape is optimized for that. The landscape shader is optimized all for that reason of being able to paint a whole bunch of different textures, a whole bunch of different shaders on there, and kind of keep things in a performance happy environment. Frank, I'll come back to your question in just a second. Actually, no, I'll just answer it right now. Frank asked, how can you make almost 90-degree angles in the terrain for when you push one side of the mesh, like in eroded sand I have, or do you do it in Uncharted for like Madagascar? So, okay, so this is going to kind of continue on what I was talking about. So we want to use our landscapes to the best of our ability. And what games do is that they don't utilize kind of the landscapes, the landscape systems, the terrain systems they have in their engine to create any kind of cliffs or 90 degrees. What you're going to do is you want to create essentially meshes to kind of cover that up. I'll show some just quick examples. Here from Madagascar. So we can see here, let's see. So we can see in this image here, we kind of have this, you know, basically almost like a 90-degree shift in terrain where we have this completely fallen off, eroded earth. You know, it's kind of all chipping away in here. Actually, can you see my mouse? I'm not sure if it comes up on the stream at all. Can you see the little mouse wiggling? Just want to make sure. Okay, cool. You never know with some of these things. So let's see if I can draw on this real quick. All right, so we have this kind of like terrain edge here. And then we have, of course, you know, these 90-degree airs. And so to kind of create this, if you imagine this with Unreal terrain, this would all be Unreal's kind of like just their normal landscape. And then you have landscape down here. And then right here, we have just a whole bunch of meshes that pretty much build up this area. And then, of course, we have mesh, like these eroded earth meshes right here. And so those are used to kind of put in place to hide the fact that we're going to get probably some really bad shearing in the landscape here. Because, you know, if you go into, ooh, how do I get rid of that? There we go. So, you know, if you come into Unreal's landscape and you were to actually sculpt something that was kind of like, you're like, okay, I need something at 90 degrees. And you're like, okay, cool, sculpting something up. I want to have whatever, my little terrain right there. You're going to obviously get a lot of kind of shearing here. And you're not going to want this because, again, you know, the Unreal's landscape is basically taking your landscape from top down and basically projecting the UVs there. So when you look at something from the side, when it has too much essentially shearing and warping like this on this like kind of 90-degree angle, you're going to want to cover this with a bunch of meshes to kind of hide that. That's essentially what we are doing here in this kind of Madagascar scene. You can see it not only with just this kind of eroded earth section, but also any of these large cliffs. I'm not creating these cliffs out of the landscape. I'm creating it out of kind of different meshes. These are all, these giant cliffs, they're all modeled in. This is how the majority of things are kind of done. You know, of course, there are going to be some studios that have specialty things, different ways to do it, but generally, this is the kind of common practice throughout the industry. I'll get into kind of like what Red Dead does, what Rockstar does in a little bit. They're a very different kind of approach to it, and it's a very time-consuming approach. But obviously, the results, you know, are really beautiful. But for what pretty much you'll always be doing at any kind of studio, and anytime you're doing your personal work, you're going to be wanting to make meshes that kind of fit into these areas that you have, you know, these kind of large shifts in terrain. That kind of just mask anything like this. So if you do have an edge where you're like, cool, I want like a cliff here, it's more ideal to have than a mesh that you would place right into this area. Now, another reason for that is that on these edges right here, you're going to probably want something that is a lot more detailed, that is kind of, if it is eroded earth, you want it to be kind of all modeled out, have a lot of neat detail, have some cool textures to it. Or if it's a cliff wall, then you're obviously going to want a bunch of the rock look to it. You're not going to want it to just be this kind of flat terrain that you're going to get, because unfortunately, you're just not going to get as much extra geo out of the landscape tool, just because it's pretty much static. The only way you can kind of slightly change it up is when you use tessellation, and which we will show off in week 10, but it's still not going to actually give you more points to kind of sculpt on. It's basically just going to smooth a lot of your terrain out. It's not actually giving you more geometry to sculpt. But basically what you are going to be wanting to do is utilizing your terrain and your meshes to kind of create any of those large shifts in direction. So like here, we've got, kind of a rock mesh here on the side to kind of, and then on the other side over here to kind of create these canyons. And so if I turn off all of these rocks, we can start to see kind of how actually simple a lot of this terrain is. The terrain is really there, or the landscape is really there to kind of just get some nice smooth undulations where you want to have smoothing results, and where you want to really get in there and paint in your landscape. Let me just turn a bunch of this crap off. Just delete that for right now. All right, so we can see our landscape here, pretty simple. It definitely has some high peaks. It's just because we're trying to smooth that into a lot of our cliffs. But for the most part, we're not doing anything too crazy in there. And yet we still have those gigantic cliffs and mountains. So we can see how dramatic things get. We don't need to have our landscape painted all the way up there. We just want the landscape to kind of help seam up a lot of areas, be able to use it to kind of paint the texture in here so you don't notice that these cliffs are kind of blending into the terrain. Again, for this, I used the same tiling rock texture that I have on my cliffs. It's the same texture I'm using in my landscape as well. It's going to help it blend a lot nicer. So those are tricks that you can use to help blend things together and not have as much of a kind of harsh transition. But that's pretty much how we go about kind of creating our landscapes. And that's why, you want to kind of try and avoid to sculpt all these kind of crazy mountains or do these crazy things. If you're going to have large shifts in kind of landscape height, you're definitely going to want to use meshes because, again, as a player, when you're kind of like just running around this environment, I don't know why I didn't spawn all the way over there, but if we're running next to this kind of cliff wall over here, we want this to look very detailed, have a lot of kind of interesting shapes and geometry in there. We don't want it to just be the smooth landscape that kind of fills up that area. You use the landscape to kind of really fill in the areas between those assets, and then, obviously kind of texture paint between them to kind of blend things out. So that's kind of how we do things at Naughty Dog. It's how most studios do things. So just kind of think about that in terms of your workflow. Think about it for your mountains as well. Of course, if you are using a program like World Machine, World Machine obviously makes those pretty cool mountains that you can kind of see way in the background, which always look really nice. But again, oftentimes they don't hold up as well when you get up really close to them. They hold up really great from the kind of far away distances. But even if you are to use World Machine, kind of the mountains, I always suggest to use them in areas outside of the gameplay space. And then you want to focus in on your landscape sculpting in a gameplay area where you're going to want to have things smooth. You're going to want to have things built with a lot of meshes to kind of really fill out this space. Did that answer your question, Frank, with the kind of utilizing meshes, utilizing a lot of the kind of eroded earth pieces? So if we kind of look at some of the model sets that I made for this Madagascar scene. So like this scene and, kind of this, we can see a lot of these assets that were created. So we have these gigantic cliffs that are, obviously massive. The player scale is way down here, really small. These kind of fit in the background. The player never actually gets up to the bases or the base of any of these mountains at all. So we have kind of, much like we've talked about before, we want to have our, kind of our big primary shapes. These are our big mountains that kind of really fill in a lot of the world, a lot of the background. We then have, kind of more of our secondary medium shapes. These, would obviously kind of fit around maybe some of the bases of these cliffs so that the player can't really ever get to see how actually low res these mountains are in comparison to how big that small little player is. And then, of course, we have these smaller rock assets that they're still a lot bigger than the player, but comparatively, we've got the big primary shapes, secondary, and tertiary for that. And then, of course, you can break even these rocks down into smaller shapes. Like this could be our big primary shape. This could be our secondary shape. And then we have our tertiary shapes. So always kind of think about that, your big primary shapes, secondary shapes, and tertiary shapes. Everything just kind of layers down and breaks down like that. And then, of course, here are some of our like eroded earth cliffs that we can utilize. And those are definitely really great to kind of help create those 90-degree angles. Let's see if, yeah, I think I got a few more shots here of them kind of up close. And the terrain is just kind of seamed up to the top of where these meshes go. And then, you can utilize the kind of whatever the texture is on the top of these eroded earth assets or rock assets and kind of paint the same texture that you would see on your landscape there. And then cover it up, possibly with some other meshes like some rocks, some flowers, some debris, some grass. Those are all great things to kind of really just disguise all those transitions. Now, I wanted to also mention how different some studios can work. So Unreal and a lot of studios have a kind of terrain engine that you are essentially painting terrain. You're painting a landscape like this. You're painting it in engine, and you basically can just click play, and then you can run around your level. You don't really have to do much else than that. Now, not every studio has its own terrain engine because it requires an immense technical team to actually build out kind of a terrain engine like this. And so a lot of studios that use proprietary engines, they just build their entire game basically in Maya, and then they port everything that they're building in Maya directly to the PS4 or Xbox dev kit. So that's how we work at Naughty Dog. Like, we don't have a really nice engine like this where, you can just place everything, you can move the lights around, you can see how it looks. Basically, what I see pretty much all day in Maya is basically a lot of this, a lot of gray wireframes, not really being able to kind of see the full exact shaders, what they look like. We have to kind of port them over to the PlayStation 4 dev kit to actually see them. You can, of course, see your textures in Maya and everything, but it's not going to look as nice as it would in game. And so the way we actually create our terrain is also very different than what Unreal does. So Unreal obviously has a really nice terrain sculpting program. You can kind of just sculpt on it. You can paint your textures down really easily at Naughty Dog. And, there are other studios that have to do this way as well. Let me see if I have an example of it. Basically, you have to hand model your terrain. So you kind of build the entire terrain. So this is like kind of this cliff section. This is this like sand dune section they made during Uncharted 3. So if we look at, we can see this is what you would probably assume you would like sculpt in Unreal's landscape editor, where you're kind of sculpting sand dunes, terrain like this. This is all this terrain here is just modeled out in Maya. And then you just are kind of painting and blending in Maya. You port it over to the engine, and then there you go. It gives you a little bit more flexibility because you can kind of create whatever terrain you want. You can add more geometry wherever you need to, and less geometry. However, it's far more time consuming, and you don't have the flexibility of just being like, oh, I'm just going to take my landscape here, just kind of sculpt up and have all of my assets move. Basically, if you want to kind of move any of your landscape, you just have to use whatever tools are in Maya to really change and deform the terrain. Red Dead does a very similar thing. However, since they are doing like an open world game, what they do is basically they hand model all of their kind of terrain, and it's based on perfect squares. So you have to kind of, if you imagine like their landscape is just a whole bunch of squares that you're kind of dividing up. So, we have like maybe a square like this, and then they'll just have like hundreds of these things to kind of create their entire world. And basically their artists have to go in there and then model out, kind of sculpt out in detail all these small little individual chunks. And then, wherever there's these seamed up connections, have to make sure that each of these chunks seam up perfectly. So it's very difficult, but it gives a really great result. And apparently it's, really performance or great for lotting things. Far better than what Unreal has, or so I've been told by some people who work there. I don't know, I've never used it. It sounds really time consuming and complex, but that's kind of how they go about doing it. So those are kind of like some of the different approaches that you should expect to encounter when you are in a actual production environment. So sometimes, you're going to have to hand model all your terrain. Sometimes you're going to have a terrain editor to kind of really paint things. And that's obviously the most ideal. And that's why we kind of really want to get used to it. Again, the majority of studios use something like Unreal, Unity, or Crysis, or something to that effect where they have an engine. It's smaller studios, or no, kind of maybe more mid-tier studios might not, or studios that kind of want to do everything very custom and by hand. So those are kind of your options. Clarence or Frank said, I also noticed that the same material on the terrain or the static mesh is a different color, or is due to the light bank or something else. So it is always going to be hard to kind of match your materials because, again, the landscape it's optimized to run as best as it can, as performance as it can, because you have so many different materials and shaders kind of layered on top of each other. And so kind of trying to get the rocks to kind of blend perfectly definitely can take a good amount of time. So if you really want to match it, you can, but obviously it just takes a little bit more work, a lot more kind of building your shaders over and over again to kind of really match things up. Clarence asks, we use Chrome for the large terrain before. Is there terrain software that still use terrain for open world? I've never heard of Chrome. Maybe. I'm not sure what Chrome's terrain editor is. So I'm assuming it's kind of also a height map based program, looks like, or kind of like a world machine. So I'm not sure. I would say that World Machine is probably the most common in terms of like a terrain generating program. Very common for kind of like open world games. Like the Assassin's Creed team, the Far Cry team, all of them, I'm pretty sure they use World Machine mixed with painting in their landscape. So they have a technical artist they have a technical artist and basically their design director kind of work together to kind of plan out the entire map that they want to have for something like Far Cry. And then they have their technical art director pretty much create the height map that is then going to be used as the base of the world. And then each artist, they have their own section of the game to kind of work on. And then they go in there. The terrain is all generated. Everyone shares the same kind of terrain mesh. And then in your individual area, you just go in there and you start sculpting out, the details that you want while keeping it to a relatively similar degree to what the landscape originally was, because you don't want to change it too much because it is based off that original height map. that height map is generally created that way for level design purposes. So there's varying degrees of how you're going to kind of be building out these landscapes in different studios. It's one of the hard things to kind of prepare for in this industry as an environment artist, is that there's so many different routes that studios take to build their own games. And it's even the same with kind of optimizing, depending on the studio that you're working at, the game type that you're working on, you're going to be building environments slightly differently and optimizing them slightly differently. Everyone has different tools for it, but I think the general purpose is always kind of the same. You're going to utilize a lot of meshes to kind of create the really interesting detailed pieces, and use the landscape to kind of feed into that, smooth out a lot of those transitions, so you don't just have single meshes just kind of jammed all over the place on a flat plane. The landscape will allow you to kind of get some cool, interesting little like berms and hills and different adjustments in how the player can traverse a space, how you can kind of lead a player along. So those are the things that we want to kind of get across when we're building our landscapes. And so while we're still on the topic of landscapes, it was obviously great to see everyone kind of getting their block meshes into Unreal, and seeing kind of the changes. The one thing that I started to see with previous students and a few this term is that you want to be careful about starting to add small, fine details to your landscapes right now. We want to really keep our landscapes really kind of open for a lot of kind of trial and error. Don't get too locked down in the block mesh you started in. It's totally cool to just be like, I really don't like that there's maybe no mountain right here. Maybe I want another mountain here. So let's see if I can just easily delete all of these trees real quick. But maybe you want a mountain here, and you're like, okay, I just kind of want to turn this. We'll go over like how to do all these like foliage painting things in the coming weeks. But maybe you're like, I really want to have a lot of cool mountains here. I don't want to change it up. It wasn't in my block mesh, but you know what? I'm going to change that. So you want to be able to leave yourself the freedom to really kind of come in here and be like, cool, I'm just going to start sculpting up maybe just some mountain ridges, change up this environment a lot, get a different feel. You don't want to get too bogged down in whatever your plan was, because the key about any kind of game environment is that design is going to always change. It's always changing. It's ever changing. Designers hate kind of sticking with whatever they design. They will always want to make something more fun. So they're going to change everything underneath you, and so you're going to have to be like, okay, now we need to have this kind of cliff here, this cliff wall, this kind of new kind of maybe protected area for for the indigenous people who live right here. And so you're like, okay, cool. Now I have to kind of adjust my environment to that. So you don't want to stay too locked into whatever you have. And one of the reasons that you want to avoid placing just a whole bunch of small details in there is that it's going to obviously require a lot of work to kind of place those assets, but B, subconsciously, once you place a bunch of these small details that have taken you time and effort to actually kind of put into your world, you're going to be slightly more subconscious to kind of not wanting to actually change a lot of those details. You're going to be like, well, I spent all this time doing this. I kind of want to make sure that, I'm not undoing a lot of the work I had already done. And so that can obviously become a quick problem if I needed to kind of make all these changes in my level. Now I easily can. Now I have this kind of nice little rock cliff that kind of protects this little village. Before there used to be maybe a path here, or maybe you have this kind of like large blocking off area, and then a designer comes in and they're like, hey, we really want to open this space up for gameplay. Can you remove this cliff? If you especially in the early stages, if you've placed a whole bunch of assets around here and you're like, no, it looks really great, I don't want to do that, it's going to waste a lot of time. And they're like, too bad, gameplay is king. So you're going to have to delete that and be like, okay, now I have to come in here and change this up. So we want to make sure that we're not getting too bogged down by all those small details. But not just that, we want to make sure that we're allowing ourselves to have a lot of that freedom to kind of go into our scenes without being locked into what we just thought our first idea was. We want to be able to kind of really play around with the space, you know, kind of treat it like a sandbox. You want to play around with the shapes, find out what's working. Not every time you kind of get into an environment, you block it out, it's going to be the right one. We want to be able to get, you know, interesting silhouettes into our environment. We don't want just to have kind of flat grounds everywhere and then maybe big mountains. You know, oftentimes that's going to be kind of boring. We want to maybe have some cool sloping hills, maybe some rolling cascading hills up to some mountain peaks, or we want to have some jagged fall offs. Want to have maybe some small little berms where the player can like walk up and then kind of like, you know, use as a trail along the mountain. And that's going to come with just some trial and error. And you want to be able to leave yourself a lot of freedom for that. So don't get too bogged down in your details, and always try to kind of really break up the terrain. You know, you don't want to have a map or an environment that is just completely flat from one area to the next. Some parts of your environment are going to probably need to be flat. For, you know, areas where people live, they generally kind of flatten those areas out, as that's what it's easier to build on. But, you know, maybe there are some kind of areas where you want to have a lot of sloping terrain, a lot of kind of jagged cliffs. So you don't want to just have this one kind of layer, because then it's like, oh, well, I just have flat terrain here, and then that's it, maybe some mountain peaks. We want to create a lot of visual interest. And again, the more kind of layering you can do in your environment, the more levels that a player can feel like they can go to, and B, just the more visual interest it's going to give you. If I had this mountain basically just kind of skirting all along here, all at the same height, and this was kind of my environment, you know, it feels a little bit more boring where we have this kind of wall of this cliff and you're like, oh, okay, that's it. I just see basically right now in this environment, it's kind of like one line right there and one line right there. And we have this equal dimension in our space. There's no kind of breakup here. And then we have this kind of gameplay space here where, you know, the player would be, and it's basically all the same level. It's all just one big flat plane with one little rock in the center. Everything is kind of is lacking a lot of dimensionality. So these are the things to think about when you are going into your environment and kind of working with the space. Don't get limited to what you started out with. And don't be afraid to kind of just change it up, make something interesting, get a lot of really cool kind of silhouettes and breakups in the skyline. Those are always kind of a really big key to making something, you know, a little bit more visually interesting. Try and keep some areas of your environment maybe a little bit heavier in terms of like the weight that is on that side, say by like a large cliff or a kind of dense foresting of trees, and then have the other side a little bit more open. It gives the eye a little bit more room to breathe. A little bit of nice negative space is always really good for the eye to kind of rest on. And it kind of just will allow the sky to create some interesting atmosphere, an interesting space, and interesting lighting. And again, you know, then when we kind of look at this space here, you know, now instead of having that one line that just kind of went across for our cliffs, we have, you know, a lot more kind of visual interest in here. You know, and then we just have those trees right there. So try to think about ways that you can kind of vary up the scope of this environment. And then, of course, to that effect, always make sure that you are moving around your environment. I know a lot of you kind of picked a cool area that you're like, cool, this is my screenshot. And then that's the only screenshot you really sent in, or you would have just 5 versions of that screenshot with maybe a camera angle like this, and then a camera angle like this. Think about how your environment is going to be seen from a player. Obviously, you're going to want to have probably your one main view that's going to look the best, going to look really cool. But then also think about like, okay, if I'm a player and I'm running through this environment and I'm being led along to maybe, some goal over here to the right, what's going to happen when I kind of just get halfway into the space? What's it going to look like then? What's it going to look like if I turn to the left? What's it going to look like if I turn to the right? Am I going to get anything interesting out of this space? What if I turn around? Now, of course, we want to make sure that these environments are kept in scope and they're not too massive. So kind of detailing out a 360-degree space can be a lot of work. So that's why I also really wanted to stress to kind of bring the environments in a little bit, make them a little smaller so that you can, get these shots where you're like, cool, I got a view right here. I really like this. And then maybe you're like, oh, now I've got a view over here. It's very different. And then I've got a view over here. That's really cool too. And then I've got, a view over here. They're all very different views. They're giving off different feelings to this one space I made. And essentially, if we look here, just that, everything that we can see, we're getting a lot of different looks from our environment. And yet we didn't need to make a gigantic open world. So that's always going to kind of come with time and a little bit of experience, but that's also why we don't want to really just lock into our initial block out and just be like, that's it, I'm done. We want to think about, okay, drop yourself into your environment, spin the camera around, look at it, take some screenshots, see which areas are really weak and which areas you think you can improve. Some areas you might want to have where it's pretty much all dominated by these rock walls. It doesn't mean that, it's bad to have, massive cliffs that kind of go all around you. That happens in real life. And sometimes that's what you need. But it's also great to have areas where you do have a lot of that negative space, a lot of that visual resting area for your eyes. And then we have some areas where it's kind of maybe really dense with a lot of foliage, a lot of trees, a lot of kind of greenery and life. So not only are we getting different shapes and different compositions in here, we're also getting a bunch of different colors. Here we're getting a lot of greens. Here we're getting a lot of kind of grays and browns. So these are ways that you can kind of really break up your environment and get a lot of mileage out of actually a small space instead of needing to make a massive space and have the same elements repeating over and over again. So hopefully all of you can kind of just drop into your environment, just spin around and just kind of look at it, take some screenshots, and try and figure out like, okay, what areas could use a lot of work? What area do you want to really focus in on for your kind of main view? Obviously that one probably is going to be the key. It's obviously the one that most people start building their environment off and then kind of be like, okay, cool. Now I've got maybe my main view here. Now I'm going to turn my camera 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees, and then see how the environment holds up for that. Frank asked, I have a first phone interview at Guerrilla Games today. Oh, very cool. Very awesome. Congratulations. Do you have any small tips or advice for that? So, I mean, that can kind of range from anything. It depends on, I guess, if you've already either done an art test or not. So if you have done an art test, it's generally a good sign that they like the work that you already done. And generally they're kind of like trying to move towards bringing you in for an actual interview into the hiring process. So one thing that I always think is really helpful is to just make sure you're completely honest in your interview. I don't think it's ever a bad thing to tell them you don't know an answer if they ask you something. Like during my interview with Naughty Dog, they asked me some normal map question that was really technical, really advanced. And I was like, at the time, especially because it's a phone interview, it's very stressful. I was like, I'm blanking on it, I don't know. And I told them, I'm like, off the top of my head, I can't tell you right now. I'm like, but obviously I know exactly where to go to kind of really find out that answer. I know kind of the general idea of what you're trying to ask here, but the exact answer, I'm not sure. And they were totally fine with an answer like that. So, don't try to don't try to make something up just to sound smart. If they ask you a question you don't know, if they're asking you something very technical, or something you're just a little unsure about, it's better to let them know that you're kind of not sure right now, um, instead of just basically making something up. And if you're just going to start making something up, it's going to make you sound far more foolish, because then they're going to be like, all right, you have no idea what you're talking about, and you don't know that you don't know you don't know that you are wrong, because you're giving an answer and they think that's the correct answer. So yeah, just make sure that you just kind of really be honest. And then the next big thing is, in any kind of interview, always make sure that you are interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you. I mean, that's a skill, or that's something you always want to kind of do at any interview, whether it's in the industry or outside of it. Because remember, they're interviewing you to see if you're a good fit for their studio, but you also need to know if their studio is a good fit for you. Just because it's a really great studio that might have a long lineage of doing really great games, really awesome stuff, doesn't mean it's the correct studio for everyone. We've had a ton of people whose dream job it was to work at Naughty Dog, and then they get to Naughty Dog and they realize this is not the kind of like work environment that they enjoy. It's not what they're used to. It's not what they kind of thought it would be like working at Naughty Dog. And so you just kind of really want to find out what their process is, kind of find out how they deal with issues, how they deal with problems, kind of the amount of work you're going to be expected to do, what their kind of crunch schedule is like. Because even though some studios will say they don't really crunch, everybody crunches to some degree. Some people, it might just be, maybe an extra hour or two for a few weeks during a project. Sometimes it's months on end. So you really kind of want to figure that out. They're always probably going to like lowball whatever their crunch is. So if they say they're like, oh, we crunch for like, a hard 6 months, it's probably like an actual hard 9 months. If they say they don't crunch at all, then they mean that they don't crunch that much, but you still be putting in those extra hours. You also want to know kind of what the team sizes are, really what your responsibilities are, kind of what they're expecting from you, and kind of what the growth opportunities are at the studio. So, because a lot of people are looking to kind of advance their careers in terms of just going from an environment artist to ideally maybe wanting to one day be a lead. Although those two don't necessarily go hand in hand that well, because leads should be people who are not really building environments or just doing art anymore. They're actually just kind of managers. They're kind of leading teams. But you really want to kind of find out how that process is. And then, yeah, just try to interview them as much as possible. Find out really what they're expecting of you in your kind of role. So those are kind of like the big things that I can think of off the top of my head for interviews. And yeah, just make sure it's not a one-sided street in terms of how the interview process goes. All right, I wanted to kind of go over a few student examples from last quarter or the last few quarters, as I know we didn't get to it last week, and I wanted to be able to show off just some other work that students have done in the 10 weeks so that you all get kind of an idea of the different kind of levels that you can expect. Now, these are just some random ones that I picked. They kind of range in skill level from people that have never really built an environment to people that have, a lot of experience building out some environments. So we just have some snowy environments here, and I'm just going to kind of flip through them just so we can kind of check them out. And one of the keys that you'll see in most of these environments is that they're obviously all very different, but when building out these spaces, you really want to focus in on the organic elements of the scenes. I know a lot of you kind of really built out these big man-made assets, and I know that was kind of part of the points of interest to kind of think about for your scenes, but we want to make sure that those points of interest can also be elements of an organic nature. They don't always have to be just man-made elements, man-made things. We want to think about what can be cool, what can happen in nature that'll make a cool point of interest in our scene without any man-made thing at all. If we kind of zoom in on this scene here that Emily did, if we just look at this, kind of ignore maybe this little temple thing, we've got a really interesting and awesome looking kind of space here. This waterfall, this nice little pool. We've got some nice shade from the trees, the river kind of flowing on, and then we have these rock outcroppings. That doesn't have any man-made elements to it at all. And yet it still becomes a really nice and pretty scene in your portfolio. And there's a whole bunch of things. You definitely don't need waterfalls to do it. Obviously, waterfalls are a great point of interest anywhere you go, but just kind of think of things that you can have. Maybe there's like a kind of cliffside that's fallen over. It's kind of just wiped out a whole bunch of land. There's a bunch of landslides. Maybe it's kind of a cliff that had fallen away and it's kind of sucked up a bunch of the trees, and there's still some trees in that kind of landslide. They're kind of sticking out. They haven't fully died yet. Maybe there's an area there was like a big avalanche. There's a whole bunch of snow that just kind of piled over things, kind of crushed things over. You can see trees that have been just smashed by the snow. Maybe there is a kind of a sandstorm, so you're going to get really heavy atmosphere in your scenes, and you're going to see a lot of kind of movement from any of the trees or foliage in your scene. So just try and think of things that could happen in your environment that would be really nice. So now this is just like kind of a different view of Emily's scene. So she had the scene over here. That was kind of our first main view. And then she kind of started to build out the rest of this space, kind of making this secondary shot, because she wanted to have obviously some more shots. And then, she utilized her landscape well in that regard of kind of having the landscape pretty much just fill in this area right here. And then was using those mesh kind of like cliff rock assets in here to kind of get these gigantic 90-degree areas. So she had some that were just kind of little cap pieces that she would put a bunch of foliage on. And then she had some that were much larger, very vertical, to kind of fill in this really big drop she wanted to have down to the waterfall. So think about ways you can utilize those assets. Also think about, or just remember that you don't need to just have one landscape in your scene. You can have multiple landscapes. So if you do want to have something like this, where you do have this, kind of very, very vertical drop, what you can have is you could have maybe like one landscape that kind of fits in this area and goes like kind of all the way back this way. And then depending on, how big maybe you have this vertical drop, if you can't get the landscape to really fill in this bottom area well, because, again, when you paint on your landscape, you're going to get a lot of kind of shearing. So if you're trying to do this and it's just not working, you're not able to get this area that is much lower than the area that is a lot higher, what you can do is then you can kind of create a second smaller landscape and put it in here and assign it a new landscape material. That always works really well. So you just have to basically go through the same landscape process of building another one. So like right here, I have just kind of another secondary landscape. This can easily be used for anything. Another great thing you can do is if you have a scene where you're kind of like all the way here and you want to have some kind of like far off mountains, you can kind of utilize a second landscape with a different maybe material on it to be that kind of like mountain range. Now, obviously you don't want to scale your landscape like this, but I'm just trying to use this as a quick little example. But maybe if you're in your environment and you just kind of see some rolling hills in the background, you can have another landscape back there with a different texture on it to get that look that there is a lot more off in the distance. This is kind of how we do things at Naughty Dog quite often with any of our world machine pieces. We just make them, we put them off in the distance, and obviously we kind of block the player off from ever getting to them, but you'll kind of be able to see them in the distance, and it gives that feeling of creating a much larger level. Clarence asks, do we need to create LODs for the rocks that are placed at the back? So like in the back of any of your environment, you definitely don't need to create any LODs for this class at all. We're just trying to make, a really great environment. Like I mentioned with the kind of different terrain engines studios use, studios also have different tools created specifically for lotting techniques. Like at Naughty Dog, we use a Simply Gone pretty heavily. It works especially well for a lot of our organic assets, but it's basically a tool that kind of just takes any mesh we make and kind of crushes it down while preserving the UVs and any vertex painting we do on those assets. Before we were using Simply Gone, we did pretty much just model LODs or LODs by hand. In case you don't know what an LOD is, it stands for level of detail, and it's basically a duplicate of your mesh that you've made at a much lower resolution detail to give you a lot of performance, and they're generally far off in the back. If you're ever playing a game, you see a lot of popping where it looks like one of your assets is fading to another. That's just because it's switching from one LOD version to the next. So LODs are pretty, kind of game dependent, technically dependent. So you're not really gonna need to make them for this class. We're not really gonna worry about having a scene that is running at an optimal performance level in Unreal. We're looking more for a really good looking portfolio piece, as again, whatever your limitations are for the game you're working on, the studio we're working on, the engine you're working on, are going to be different at every place you work. So the limitations that I have for any of the stuff for Uncharted or The Last of Us is very different than the limitations are for, let's say, Red Dead Redemption and Rockstar. Their kind of limitations of what they have to work with far less because they have a much bigger, wide open game. And, for a game like Uncharted or The Last of Us, where it's kind of more like, I guess, kind of like arted up corridors, like you're kind of very on a single track. You don't have as many big, wide open spaces. You can have a lot more budget to kind of play around with. You don't have to worry about possibly LODs as much. So it really just kind of depends. And then it can also depend on the level that you're working on. So a lot of Uncharted levels are very linear, very small. So we can pack in a lot of detail. And that's why, a lot of the levels look really great. But then for, a lot of the levels that I did for in terms of like Lost Legacy or Uncharted 4, both of them were like the biggest levels that we had in Uncharted ever each time. So the Madagascar level was the biggest level that we had done in an Uncharted game. And then when we did the Western Ghats level, that was significantly bigger than it. So it kept getting bigger. And then the amount of technical hurdles and like detail that you can kind of put into these levels drops dramatically. But, you try and work around that with creative solutions for kind of lotting out a lot of these things, kind of blocking the player's view, utilizing things like cliffs and valleys to kind of hide things. So if, for example, I have this like large cliff here, it's going to block the view of whatever is on, say, the other side here. So I don't need to have any of those assets loaded. So that's one way one thing that you can do technically to kind of mask out a lot of detail is, using kind of high walls, things that occlude or block your view from seeing them. And so you don't need to have them loaded. But again, it really kind of comes down to the game that you're really working on and kind of what you are doing. So, we have some jungle scenes, and you can see that every scene has its own kind of different color palette, its own different mood. And a lot of them have really great kind of changes in height in a lot of them. And I think that always gives an environment a much nicer feel than something that is just very flat. Some of the spaces are, they are kind of flat here, but, they still are really playing with a lot of the organic elements, and they can still really look really nice, even when they are a little flat. But I always think that spaces that have a lot of height change just become a little bit more interesting for a player to kind of work around. And so these are all, this was Leonid's scene. He did like a really great scene. And one thing that he did that was really cool is that he had 2 lighting scenarios for it. I always think this is, a really cool thing to add to your portfolio. He did this in week 10, where he kind of switched it up, kind of changed up his lighting so he could have 2 different lighting moods and show things off. But we can see here, he only has this small plane, and even then the plane, he said, took him, the full week to make. So again, we really want to make sure that we are focusing in on all the organic elements, because, again, they are pretty difficult to kind of really mess with and really understand how to build out a lot of these scenes. We can use atmosphere in our scenes to kind of get some really cool and dramatic views. This was another scene that was really great. Omar had a few of these sculpts already kind of ready to go before the class started, if I recall correctly. So he was able to make these like really low resolution, detailed kind of dwarven fortresses that he kind of stuck on the mountains. And then, of course, this giant mountain here is sculpt in ZBrush. It's not using the Unreal Terrain. So again, just remember, our landscapes are going to be there to allow us to paint a lot of our detail on. And then for kind of large cliffs and, these vertical drops here, you can utilize different assets. But those are just, some examples. There's obviously a whole bunch more if any of you ever want to see, and I can just quickly flip through them maybe next week as well, in case you are interested, just to get an idea of what people are kind of completing in the 10-week class. And, some of these people haven't really made an environment. Some of them have. So it really just kind of depends on kind of their skill level on where they're kind of really getting it. Clarence asks, for the screenshots shown in the ArtStation, were those scenes from the artist's original scene or after optimization process? So which scenes do you mean? Which ones are you referring to? Like these right here? Or these screenshots here? Okay, so yeah, so this screenshot here obviously is from the Western Ghats in Uncharted Lost Legacy. This is after pretty much all the optimization had been done in the scene, so it's pretty much at its peak optimization that it could really get, and everything. Generally, when you are working on a big scene like this, you have to really plan for a lot of these optimization techniques and everything. So you're going to have far less detail in a lot of these like rock meshes and rock assets. We have a lot of things that block a lot of views and sight lines. So like this temple that you get right here, this is a large combat space that there's all this combat in there, but we kind of placed it up here on this like cliff ledge that, so you could see it from wherever you were in the kind of big open hub that this level is. But what that also allowed us to do is that to get into this space, you had to kind of jump over a little ledge. You get kind of like locked into just this entire little combat space up there. And then we can drop out a lot of detail around the level. And then we just switch to kind of more LODs. Another thing that we did that's, again, very technical and really very dependent on whatever engine you're using. We have what we call proxy LODs for basically an entire level. So if we see here, it might be a little hard to tell, I guess, because they came out pretty nice. But this entire section here is basically a bunch of really low resolution meshes all kind of baked down into kind of one really big texture. And we kind of did that throughout this entire big open hub. And so there was another one here. There was one like right here as well. And so basically they're like super aggressively low detailed, far away wide shots, or what we refer to as wide shots. So things that are outside the playable space. So that way, when the player is like, say, in this tower, looking out at any of these kind of like areas and directions, they're not seeing the full level being loaded. They're just seeing kind of one of these extreme LODs that have a lot less detail. It's very similar to Unreal's kind of world composition, where you're essentially unloading and loading different chunks of the world. So like this entire level was kind of broken up into just like a whole bunch of just different chunks that were like in here. And so, we would kind of like unload this level, like all the detail art, and then load in the super low, what we call proxies for these areas, which are, again, just basically a really low res version of this entire world. And with just like a texture for it. So you don't need all the detail. So that's kind of, so any of these screenshots, they're all from game. They all are with all the included optimizations. But again, that kind of really comes down to whatever game you are working on and whatever project you're working on. All right, the last thing I wanted to mention before we wrap this up is for next week, we're going over, or I guess it's, this coming up week right now, week 3 is all about rocks and rock creation. So that's always exciting. When it comes to kind of creating your rocks, always try and really focus in on the large details, all the silhouette shapes. I always want to try and stress that. I think I did in the videos quite a lot. But each class I have, people are always like they're painting in these small little cracks even on their first rocks, when their overall silhouetted shapes are basically just a kind of cube with some beveled edges. So really focus in on those overall silhouette shapes of your rocks. Keep your reference handy with you, pretty much like right next to you. If you don't have a second monitor, obviously, highly recommend investing in one so you can just have a whole bunch of reference images up on while you're kind of sculpting these rocks. I never sculpt rocks from basically just imagination. I'm always having a whole bunch of rocks on screen of the style of rocks I want to kind of create, and using those as reference to kind of be like, okay, cool, this is what some of these rocks look like. I'm going to, pull in a lot of these elements. If you don't have a second monitor, you have pretty much one. I would assume most of you have one in kind of your hand with your cell phone. So it's always great to kind of put just some rock reference on there. Just have it next to your desk so you can kind of like look at it, scroll through a few images, and kind of sculpt that way. Also, if you prefer to use Mudbox, totally go ahead and use Mudbox. I show off ZBrush because ZBrush is obviously the most commonly used kind of sculpting program. And the one that you'll probably see most often. But I would say Mudbox has a easier barrier to entry for it. But ZBrush just allows you to do so much more, and it is kind of very much the staple. Also, when I mentioned about creating kind of a 360-degree hero rock, you don't have to make a rock that kind of is 360 degrees, all kind of, you could rotate that rock any way you want. So for a lot of the kind of eroded earth areas in Uncharted, I didn't create a 360-degree asset. I basically created kind of a 180. It's basically just half of this kind of forward-facing mesh that is all detailed, and the back is completely empty. Now, you can apply that principle also to a lot of rocks, and we did. We didn't have every rock be, a rock that you could kind of walk around in every which way, kind of like a rock like this, where again, I can spin it anyway, pretty much except for at the bottom, and it'll always look like a big old rock that'll fit nicely in my environment. For some areas that you're kind of doing, you're going to want to have, essentially you don't need to have the other side of these rocks made. If you're making things like caves or canyons, sometimes it's actually beneficial to actually just create the kind of opening facade of this rock. So just basically this one front face, and then you can duplicate it and rotate it around to fill up any other area. So like a quick example is, so these were some rocks that we created for Uncharted 4. You can see here that, again, the rock is basically just this little flat plane. All the details right here, we're able to get a lot of really nice detail in there. But the back of the rock, if you basically spun this rock around, it's completely open. There's no detail there. We didn't need to spend a whole bunch of time sculpting out 360 degrees, making sure it looks great from every angle, because we knew we were just using these in either areas that we wanted to have canyons, or that we'd want to have it always just facing this, pretty much this view. These rocks are great for when you are kind of, again, when we are sculpting up maybe a large wall of terrain here. So, we've come in here, we've sculpted up our terrain. We're like, cool, that looks great, whatever. We want to have, maybe that rock wall placed right along here. We're never going to see what's behind this kind of sculpted up terrain. We just want a really nice rock wall and facade right there. So depending on your environment, you can definitely make rocks in this style. They're obviously really great for performance, because you don't have essentially this entire section of the rock modeled out. That's never seen. So it's saving on a lot of geometry in that regard. And sometimes they can be a little bit more time efficient to make a rock like that, where you kind of just create one half of a rock, kind of sculpt that out, and then have that as your mesh. You're not having to be like, okay, now I need to sculpt this kind of amount of detail, but on the other side. You certainly can, though, if you want, and you want to kind of create that. But this is just another option for you to kind of think about to add to your rock collection. I know some of you are dealing with scenes that have a lot of rocks, and some of you are dealing with scenes that don't have that many. So there is a really nice balance there. If you have a scene that has a lot of rocks in there, you might want to think about creating some extra rocks like this to really get the most out of your scene, get the most variety out of there. So hopefully that helps. We'll go over some more rock examples next week as well, so that you can kind of just see and think about other rocks that you can create, add to your palette of rocks that will help create your environment. And again, don't get discouraged on rocks. They are very hard. Even to this day, like when I'm making rocks, I'm still struggling with them sometimes. Sometimes you feel like you're sculpting forever, and you're just like, some of these shapes are just not working. What I always like to do is just maybe take a break for a little bit, work on another asset, or just kind of consult my reference, see what I'm missing from my reference, and try and put those details into my rocks. All right, I think that'll be it for this week. Yeah, I think that'll be it. There's, obviously there's more stuff we can go over. Hopefully we'll be able to cover some more interesting things next week as well. If you have any questions, make sure you kind of like place them down here. I'll hopefully be able to answer them as best I can. Kim, I saw your issue with your terrain here, where it's like every time you're painting down with the height map, it's essentially disappearing. So I'm not sure exactly what it is off the top of my head. I'll have to kind of dig into it, because it looks like things are set up correctly, but it's not actually layering on top of each other. It's just erasing your kind of previous one. So there's definitely something up. Let me know, or I'll look at it, see if I can try and figure out what is going on. And of course, for next week's assignment, remember, you don't need to send in full Unreal scenes. They're just way too big to actually utilize. Screenshots are great. 5 to 10 screenshots are a great amount. Get some good angles of your environment or your rocks or whatever it is you're working on. That way I can kind of just talk about them, see exactly all the views, doodle on them, give you some, kind of feedback from there. And with that, we'll close out this week. Thanks everyone for sticking it out. And I can't wait to see all the rocks you guys are going to be making this week. It's always an exciting time. Have a good one. Yeah, and thanks for all the questions, everyone. It's always great to have them pop up in the live Q&A so we can go over. Good luck, of course, on the phone interview. Let me know how that goes. That's always exciting.